I stand before you not as a president, not as a soldier, but as a son of this continent. A continent bleeding not from its wounds, but from its betrayal. My heart is heavy and my voice trembles not out of fear, but from pain. Pain born of watching our people cry for dignity, while our so-called leaders dine in air-conditioned halls. I did not take up arms to protect borders drawn by colonizers. I rose for our people, the farmers, the children, the mothers who walk miles for water, and the youth who die dreaming of Europe because their land offers them nothing. And yet, while our homes burn and our soil is soaked in the blood of patriots, the African Union remains silent, powerless, absent. What is the purpose of an African Union that does not protect Africans? What is its role when the cries of the Sahel go unheard, when imperial forces rob our resources in broad daylight, and we get no more than a statement of concern? What has become of the spirit of unity, of solidarity, of resistance that once fueled our liberation movements? We sit in golden chairs at summits while our people sleep on dirt floors. We chant Pan-Africanism while handing over our sovereignty to foreign corporations. Is this the union our forefathers envisioned when they gave their lives for our independence? Is this what Sankara died for? What Lumumba was murdered for? If I speak with emotion, if my eyes water, it is not weakness. It is because I have carried the bodies of children killed by bombs we did not drop. It is because I have looked into the eyes of widows who asked me, "Where is Africa?" and I had no answer. We do not need another resolution. We need action. We do not need applause in Addis Ababa while we are buried in Ouagadougou. We need solidarity, not symbolism. We need an African Union that defends Africa, not one that waits for permission to speak for fear of offending those who still treat us as subjects. If the African Union will not rise for its people, then the people will rise without it. Because history has shown that when the institutions fail, it is the people who ignite change. Africa is not poor, it is plundered. Africa is not weak, it is betrayed. And I say to every leader who still has a soul left in them, wake up, stand up, before it is too late. Because our people will not wait forever. The African Union has failed to protect African lives and sovereignty. That is the painful truth we must confront if we are to move forward with honesty and integrity. While ordinary people suffer under the weight of conflict, poverty, and neo-colonial exploitation, the African Union, an institution created with the dream of African unity, dignity, and self-determination, has become a hollow structure, more concerned with appearances than action. It meets in luxury and speaks in carefully crafted statements, but on the ground, where lives are being lost and nations destabilized, its presence is either weak or completely absent. Across the continent, from the Sahel to the Horn of Africa and in Central Africa, people are being displaced by war and instability. In many cases, these conflicts are fueled by external interests seeking to exploit our mineral wealth and natural resources. Foreign armies and mercenaries operate on African soil with impunity, often under the guise of partnership or anti-terror efforts, while local communities suffer. Entire villages are erased, farmers are driven from their land, women are subjected to unspeakable violence. And in all of this, the African Union remains passive, watching from the sidelines as the sovereignty of member states is violated repeatedly. This is not what the AU was meant to be. It was envisioned as a united body that would protect Africa from the very forces that once enslaved and colonized us. But what we see now is an institution that waits for approval from former colonial powers before lifting a finger. Instead of standing firm against injustice, it seeks consensus and permission, watering down its principles to please those who never had Africa's best interests at heart. When foreign troops bomb African towns, or when foreign companies manipulate governments to loot resources, where is the voice of the African Union? Where is the outrage, the condemnation, the defense of our people's dignity? The AU has become a body of empty resolutions. Year after year, it holds summits and releases communiques, but those words rarely translate into meaningful action. The people do not feel its presence in their daily struggles. They do not see the AU building schools, protecting borders, feeding the hungry, or holding foreign powers accountable. It has lost touch with its mission because it is too focused on diplomacy and protocol, too afraid to offend global powers, too cautious to act boldly when boldness is exactly what this continent needs. This failure has led to a dangerous loss of faith among the African people, especially the youth. They look at the African Union and see no reflection of their hopes or aspirations. They see an organization that cannot protect them from hunger or violence, that cannot even speak boldly when African lives are taken. That disillusionment is driving our young people to flee the continent in search of dignity elsewhere, often risking death in the Mediterranean Sea because they no longer believe in the promise of Africa. If the African Union cannot protect the people it claims to represent, then its relevance must be questioned. If it cannot defend African sovereignty when it is under attack, then what purpose does it serve? The time for symbolic speeches and carefully worded condemnations has passed. Our people are dying, and they do not need more silence disguised as diplomacy. They need protection. They need leadership. They need an African Union that serves Africa, not one that pleases outsiders. Until that changes, it will remain a failed institution in the eyes of those who matter most, the African people. African leaders have become increasingly disconnected from the very people they were elected to serve. And this disconnect is one of the most damaging forces undermining the future of the continent. For far too long, the elite class of politicians, diplomats, and decision-makers have basked in luxury and privilege, far removed from the struggles of ordinary Africans. They travel the world attending international conferences, speaking at summits, and enjoying the comforts of power, while the citizens they represent endure hardships unimaginable to those who occupy the halls of power. This growing gulf between leadership and the people is not just an issue of governance. It is a deep betrayal of the very ideals of Pan-Africanism, the principles of unity, justice, and dignity that our freedom fighters fought and died for. Across the continent, millions of Africans face extreme poverty, hunger, displacement, and insecurity. Entire communities live without basic services like clean water, healthcare, or education. Conflict and violence continue to ravage countries, displacing entire populations. Yet, while people are fleeing from war, famine, and the lack of opportunity, African leaders are more concerned with their personal wealth, international recognition, and maintaining their hold on power. They enjoy lifestyles that are starkly out of touch with the daily reality of the people they govern. Private jets, luxurious mansions, and international shopping sprees are often the symbols of African leadership, while millions of children go to bed hungry every night. These leaders seem to be more interested in protecting their own interests and securing their place in the global elite than addressing the very issues that brought them to power. How can a leader who lives in comfort and wealth truly understand the pain of a mother who cannot feed her children or a father who struggles to find work? How can they advocate for the needs of the people when their interests are fundamentally detached from the reality of their citizens' lives? The result of this disconnect is a deepening sense of frustration and betrayal among the people. African citizens increasingly feel abandoned by their leaders. They no longer believe that the state is working in their interest, and many have lost all faith in the political systems that were meant to deliver justice and equality. Instead of serving as beacons of hope and change, many leaders have become symbols of oppression and corruption, standing in the way of progress rather than fostering it. This betrayal is not only a moral failing, but also a political one. The foundation of Pan-Africanism was built on the idea of unity, self-reliance, and collective prosperity for all Africans. Leaders were meant to work toward the upliftment of their people, not their own enrichment. But what we see today are governments riddled with corruption, leaders who prioritize foreign investments over local development, and political elites who think more about how to secure loans from the West than how to create jobs or infrastructure for their citizens. The continent's vast wealth in natural resources is often squandered, mismanaged, or siphoned off by the very leaders who were meant to protect it for future generations. The result is that Africa continues to face the same issues that it has battled for decades: economic inequality, social unrest, and the perpetuation of poverty. Leaders who are so disconnected from their people cannot possibly lead effectively. If they do not see the human suffering on the ground, if they do not understand the needs of the population, how can they make decisions that benefit the people they represent? How can they craft policies that alleviate suffering when they have no understanding of the daily struggles of ordinary citizens? This disconnection has consequences far beyond the political realm. It erodes trust in institutions, leads to disenfranchisement, and fuels the cycle of poverty. When people see their leaders living in excess while they suffer, they begin to question the legitimacy of their governments. The result is an erosion of faith in democratic processes, as people no longer believe that voting, protesting, or engaging with the state will change their circumstances. This frustration can lead to apathy, or worse, violence and rebellion, as people begin to take matters into their own hands. Africa needs a new kind of leadership, one that is grounded in empathy, in service to the people, and in the real struggles that Africans face every day. It needs leaders who live like their people, understand their challenges, and commit to resolving them. Only then can the continent move beyond the cycles of poverty and inequality that have held it back for far too long. Pan-Africanism cannot remain an abstract ideal. It must become a tangible reality for every African. If our leaders fail to reconnect with the people, the dream of united, prosperous Africa will remain nothing more than a distant fantasy. Foreign powers continue to exploit Africa with little resistance, a reality that has plagued the continent for centuries. Despite the cries for independence, sovereignty, and economic self-determination that resounded across Africa during the mid-20th century, it seems that the continent remains in the grip of external forces that strip it of its resources and opportunities. From multinational corporations to foreign governments, Africa's vast natural wealth continues to be plundered with little or no resistance, and the African Union, AU, seems impotent in its efforts to stop this neo-colonial exploitation. The continent remains a battleground for foreign interests, and its people continue to bear the weight of this exploitation while the AU stands by, offering only platitudes and gestures that fail to create meaningful change. Africa is a continent rich in resources, from oil and gas to gold, diamonds, cobalt, and vast agricultural potential. These resources should be a source of prosperity, not poverty. Yet, time and again, Africa's natural wealth is siphoned off by foreign powers, through multinational corporations that take advantage of weak regulations and corrupt governments, and through international agreements that do little to benefit local population. For example, the mining of precious metals and minerals in countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC, has been marked by human rights violations, environmental destruction, and the creation of cycles of conflict. Similarly, oil extraction in places like Nigeria has brought little more than environmental degradation, displacement of communities, and the enrichment of foreign companies and corrupt local elites. Instead of these resources being used to benefit the people, they are sold to the highest bidder, often with no regard for the long-term consequences. The African Union, as a collective body that represents the interests of African nations, should be the first line of defense against such exploitation. It should be leading the charge to secure fair trade agreements, enforce regulations that protect local communities, and push for the reinvestment of resource wealth into the development of African infrastructure and industry. Yet the reality is far different. The AU's response to the ongoing plunder of Africa's resources has been at best ineffective and at worst complicit. The AU often fails to take strong action against foreign exploitation, choosing instead to engage in diplomatic dialogue that rarely results in concrete outcomes. When foreign companies extract resources without paying fair taxes or compensating local workers adequately, the AU remains silent. When foreign governments intervene in African affairs for strategic purposes, the AU is too often passive, unwilling to confront the powers that continue to perpetuate the exploitation of Africa. One of the key reasons for this continued exploitation is the lack of political will among African leaders. Many are either unwilling or unable to challenge the powerful forces that continue to exploit Africa's resources. Some leaders are themselves complicit in the system as they benefit from corrupt deals that line their pockets while leaving their people in poverty. There is also the issue of dependency. Many African countries rely heavily on foreign aid and investment, which means they are reluctant to challenge the very powers upon which they depend. These dynamics have created a dangerous cycle where Africa is increasingly unable to assert its sovereignty in the face of foreign pressures. The absence of a strong, unified stance from the AU has allowed neocolonialism to thrive unchecked. Neocolonialism is the modern form of domination that seeks to control Africa not through direct military occupation, but through economic and political influence. Foreign powers use debt traps, exploitative trade agreements, and control of resources to maintain a form of indirect control over African nations. They dictate the terms of development, often benefiting their own economies at the expense of African well-being. For example, China's influence in Africa, while hailed as a partnership, often comes at the cost of local development. African nations are increasingly indebted to foreign powers, and this debt burden leaves them with little room to negotiate better terms for their people. In exchange for loans, foreign governments and companies extract Africa's resources, leaving little in return for the development of local industries or infrastructure. At the same time, multinational companies often operate with impunity, taking advantage of the weak enforcement of labor laws, environmental protections, and tax regulations in African countries. These companies make enormous profits from African resources, but the wealth rarely makes its way back to the communities that should benefit from it. Local workers are paid poorly and subjected to dangerous working conditions, while entire ecosystems are destroyed in the name of profit. Yet the AU, instead of taking decisive action to demand reparations, fair trade practices, and environmental protection, continues to engage in dialogue that leads nowhere. The lack of effective resistance to foreign exploitation has severe consequences for Africa's future. It means that the continent remains locked in a state of dependency, unable to break free from the cycle of poverty and underdevelopment. It means that African countries continue to miss the opportunity to use their vast resources to create jobs, build infrastructure, and foster innovation that could drive economic growth and self-sufficiency. The African people, the rightful owners of these resources, remain excluded from the wealth that is rightfully theirs. For Africa to truly prosper and break free from the chains of neocolonialism, the AU must take bold and decisive action. It must demand that foreign powers respect the sovereignty of African nations and that multinational companies pay their fair share. The exploitation of Africa's resources must end, and the wealth must be reinvested into the development of the continent for the benefit of its people. Until then, Africa will remain a continent rich in resources but poor in opportunity, its future compromised by the continued exploitation of foreign powers and the complacency of its own leadership. The African Union, AU, as the continent's foremost organization designed to unify and represent African nations, was built on the principles of African dignity, independence, and self-determination. However, over the years, it has become increasingly evident that the AU's leadership is more focused on diplomacy and maintaining relationships with Western powers than on fulfilling its core duty to defend Africa's interests. Fearful of offending Western countries, the AU often chooses silence and inaction, prioritizing diplomatic niceties over the urgent need to safeguard the dignity, sovereignty, and independence of the African people. This reluctance to take a firm stance on crucial matters of African interest has allowed foreign powers to continue their exploitation of the continent, leaving Africa's future at the mercy of external forces. The AU was created to ensure that African countries would no longer have to rely on foreign powers for decisions that affect their own futures. It was meant to be a forum for strengthening the continent's unity and amplifying the voices of African nations on the global stage. But instead of using this power to confront issues like foreign exploitation, military intervention, or human rights abuses within and outside the continent, the AU too often prioritizes maintaining diplomatic relations with powerful Western nations. This approach has led to the erosion of Africa's autonomy in international negotiations, as the AU frequently bends its stance to avoid angering the West, thereby sacrificing its commitment to African development and self-determination. One of the clearest examples of the AU's diplomatic timidity can be seen in its dealings with foreign intervention on African soil. Over the years, Western military presence and influence have remained constant, whether in the form of counterterrorism operations, peacekeeping missions, or bilateral military partnerships. In countries like Mali, Libya, and Somalia, Western powers have intervened under the guise of stability and counterterrorism, often without the consent or full backing of African governments. Yet the AU, an institution that should prioritize the protection of African sovereignty, often fails to take a strong stand against these interventions. It has largely refrained from publicly challenging Western powers, or demanding that they respect the sovereignty of African states. The Western powers has refused to take a strong stand against the sovereignty of African states. In doing so, the AU has allowed foreign powers to continue meddling in African affairs, diminishing the continent's ability to control its own destiny. This fear of confrontation is also evident in the AU's treatment of multinational corporations that exploit Africa's resources. When foreign companies strip the continent of its natural wealth, whether it is through mining, oil extraction, or agricultural production, the AU often remains silent, afraid to jeopardize the investment flows from these corporations or the political relationships with the countries in which they are based. The AU rarely takes meaningful action to demand that these companies provide fair compensation for the resources they extract, or to hold them accountable for the environmental damage they cause. Instead, African countries continue to sign trade deals that benefit foreign corporations at the expense of local populations, leaving millions of Africans without the benefits of their own resources. The AU's refusal to assert itself against these exploitative practices further reinforces the power imbalance between Africa and the West, perpetuating a cycle of dependency and underdevelopment. Perhaps one of the most painful examples of the AU's diplomatic priorities overshadowing its duty to Africa is its inability to effectively address the issue of foreign debt. Many African nations are trapped in a cycle of borrowing from Western financial institutions and governments, which in turn hampers their economic development and sovereignty. The AU has been largely ineffective in creating strategies to address the mounting debt crisis that many African nations face. Rather than demanding that these debts be restructured, reduced, or forgiven, the AU often quietly accepts the terms imposed by Western lenders, even when they are detrimental to the well-being of African citizens. This diplomatic subservience to the West, particularly in financial matters, further stifles Africa's potential for growth and self-sufficiency. The AU's hesitation to act on behalf of the African people also stems from the internal divisions within the organization itself. The different political and economic priorities of its member states often lead to a fragmented approach to global issues. Some African leaders may be more inclined to protect their relationships with Western powers because of their personal or economic ties, while others may be too focused on maintaining political stability at home to risk taking bold actions on the international stage. This lack of unity and resolve has made the AU an institution that is reactive rather than proactive, leaving Africa vulnerable to the influence of external forces. At the heart of this diplomatic timidity is a deep fear of offending Western powers. The legacy of colonialism still looms large, and for many African leaders, the idea of challenging Western nations who continue to hold significant economic, political, and military power feels too risky. The AU's reluctance to confront these powers has led to a situation where African nations are often forced to compromise their values and priorities in order to secure Western support. In the process, Africa's dignity and independence have been undermined, and the promises of the Pan-African dream, a unified, self-reliant, and empowered continent, remain elusive. The African Union must shift its focus from diplomacy for diplomacy's sake and start prioritizing the well-being and sovereignty of African people. It must have the courage to challenge Western powers when their actions undermine Africa's interests, and it must demand that African nations have the freedom to determine their own political, economic, and social futures. The AU should not fear confrontation. It should fear the continued exploitation and marginalization of its own people. Until it becomes an organization that places Africa's interests above all else, it will remain an ineffective institution, unable to fulfill its duty to the people it was created to serve. The youth of Africa, the very generation that should be driving the continent's progress, are increasingly losing faith in the institutions that were meant to serve them. For years, young people across the continent have seen their hopes for a better future dashed by systemic unemployment, underdevelopment, and government neglect. This disillusionment is not just a passing frustration, it is a profound crisis of confidence in the ability of African governments and the African Union, AU, to provide meaningful opportunities or defend their interests. With few prospects for jobs, education, or even basic infrastructure, many young Africans are left with little choice but to risk everything in the hopes of escaping the continent. Their decision to embark on perilous journeys to Europe or elsewhere is not a desire for luxury or comfort, but a desperate cry for survival and dignity, a sign of a generation that feels abandoned and betrayed. For far too many young Africans, the promise of a better life has remained just that, a promise. Africa is home to the world's youngest population. Yet despite this demographic advantage, the continent's youth continue to face staggering levels of unemployment. According to various reports, over 60% of Africa's youth are unemployed or underemployed, and those who do manage to find work are often stuck in low-wage, informal jobs with little hope of upward mobility. Education, which is meant to be the key to unlocking opportunity, is often inaccessible or inadequate. Even those who complete their studies find themselves without the skills or opportunities that the modern job market demands. This crushing reality has created a generation of young people who are not only economically disenfranchised, but are also deprived of hope, purpose, and agency. Many African governments have failed to invest in their youth, prioritizing short-term political gains or the interests of the elite over long-term investments in education, healthcare, and employment. Corruption and mismanagement often drain the public coffers, leaving little to nothing for the future generation. As a result, many young Africans find themselves stuck in a cycle of poverty, unable to break free from the limitations imposed by their governments. Worse still, they see their political leaders enjoying a life of luxury while they struggle to make ends meet. This stark contrast between the ruling elite and the masses fosters a sense of injustice and betrayal, deepening the divide between Africa's leaders and its youth. The African Union, intended to be a voice for the collective aspirations of the continent, has also failed to address the systemic challenges facing Africa's youth. Instead of actively working on initiatives to tackle unemployment, promote entrepreneurship, and ensure that young people have access to education and skills training, the AU has often been more focused on diplomacy and political posturing. While the AU holds summits and engages in high-level talks about Africa's future, it seems disconnected from the reality faced by millions of young Africans who are being left behind. The AU's inability to deliver on its promises has further alienated a generation that is starting to question whether the institution is truly working in their interest. This abandonment by both national governments and the African Union has had severe consequences. The result is an exodus of young Africans seeking opportunities abroad, often under dangerous and life-threatening conditions. The Mediterranean Sea has become a graveyard for many, with thousands of young people drowning each year while attempting to cross into Europe in search of a better life. Others take perilous routes through the Sahara Desert or across other perilous landscapes, driven by the belief that anything, even death, is preferable to the stagnation and hopelessness they face at home. This mass migration is not just a tragedy in terms of lives lost, but also a failure of African institutions to provide for their most vital resource, the youth. The rise in migration is, at its core, a symptom of a deeper problem: the erosion of trust in African leadership. When young people feel that their governments and regional institutions, like the AU, have no interest in their well-being or future, they become disillusioned and look for alternatives. They no longer see any benefit in staying and contributing to a system that has failed them. Their hope for change is not nurtured by their leaders, leaving them to look elsewhere, often at great risk. This outflow of talent and energy is not just a loss for the individual nations, it is a loss for Africa as a whole. The continent is hemorrhaging its brightest minds, and instead of being invested in the development of their own countries, many of Africa's youth are forced to invest their time and energy into survival elsewhere. The situation is even more dire when we consider that many of the most vulnerable youth come from conflict-affected areas or impoverished backgrounds, where the lack of opportunities is compounded by violence and instability. These young people face not only the lack of a future, but also the constant threat of war and displacement. They become fodder for armed groups or are left to roam in refugee camps, where their lives are suspended in a state of uncertainty. The failure of African governments and the AU to address the root causes of instability, such as poverty, corruption, and political failure, exacerbates the already dire situation for these young people. In order for Africa to reverse this trend, significant changes must be made. The AU must shift from being a passive institution focused on diplomacy to a proactive body that delivers real results for the African people. It must push for policies that promote youth employment, invest in skills development, and provide the necessary infrastructure to support entrepreneurial ventures. African governments must also commit to genuine reforms, investing in education, healthcare, and job creation. These actions will not only provide opportunities for young people, but will also help to rebuild trust in the institutions that are meant to serve them. Without a clear and decisive commitment to Africa's youth, the continent risks losing an entire generation. The future of Africa is in the hands of its young people, but they can only build that future if they are given the tools to succeed. The time to act is now, before the continent's brightest minds are lost forever. If the AU won't act, the people will. Traore warns that real change will come from the streets if institutions fail to serve the people, a call for revolutionary responsibility and leadership from within.